thank you all for coming. We're delighted to welcome you to the first event in the Nonfiction Writing Program's series of public lectures for academic year 2021. It has been a different kind of year, so this is our first public event that we've had in a long time. We're happy to see you via Zoom and grateful to Brown University's Media Services for making it possible to sustain this series. However limited it may be by circumstances. So I'm Carol DeBoer Langworthy, the coordinator of lectures for the Nonfiction Writing Program here at Brown. And tonight we have the distinct pleasure of featuring one of our own faculty members, Tracy Breton, as host of a conversation with the distinguished journalist, Dan Barry of the New York Times. We will learn, of course, that Dan is really a Rhode Islander because once a Rhode Islander, always a Rhode Islander. So Tracy is the Clarence Raymond Adams and Rachel Blodgett Adams visiting professor of English in the Department of English with the Nonfiction Writing Program. And she is the mainstay of the journalism portion of the Nonfiction Writing Program. And this all began in the late 90s under the shared direction of Beth Taylor and Larry Stanley, who are now both distinguished senior lecturers in the program. Our NF program now offers courses covering everything from academic and research writing to experimental and lyric essays, along with courses about writing memoir, personal narrative, history, travel, food, medicine, and science, as well as courses in, of course, beginning and advanced journalism. Tracy has been a member of the NF faculty since its beginning, starting with part-time work while she maintained a full career as a lead reporter for the Providence Journal. She, along with Dan, was a member of the investigative reporting team that, in a series of stories, exposed corruption in the Rhode Island courts. That series led to the resignation and conviction of the state's chief justice and his top administrator, and a Pulitzer Prize in reporting for Dan and Tracy and a small group of other reporters at the Journal in 1994. Tracy was a finalist for another Pulitzer as part of a larger team of reporters for stories about the 2003 station fire. She also has received many other prizes. She received recently the Master Reporter Award from the New England Society of Journalists in 1995 and was inducted recently into the Rhode Island Journalism Hall of Fame. So we are in the hands of an expert interviewer, I think it's fair to say. I have just one more little thing to say, how this is going to work tonight. You will be muted automatically during the presentation. For the question and answer period, please use the raised hand function, and that will bring your little face up to the top of the screen. Tracy may call on you, then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. So I think without any further ado, I will turn it over to Tracy and Dan.
Good evening, everybody. So I get to introduce my friend Dan Barry here, who grew up on Long Island and graduated with a journalism degree from St. Bonaventure University in upstate New York. He aspired at the time to be like gonzo journalist Hunter S. Thompson, but there wasn't a great demand in journalism for a recent college graduate with a smart aleck attitude, so he went to work digging ditches and working in delis. He eventually earned a work-study scholarship to the Journalism Graduate School at New York University, after which he went back to digging ditches. Finally, in 1983, he landed a job at the Journal-Inquirer in Manchester, Connecticut, where he covered school boards, prisons, and the occasional murder. In 1987, he was hired at the Providence Journal, where he served as a general assignment reporter, the West Warwick bureau manager, and a member of the paper's investigative team, which, as Carol mentioned, won a Pulitzer Prize for a series of stories about court corruption in 1994. I was part of that team and thrilled to be able to work with some really talented reporters and editors, some of whom are on this Zoom tonight. And Dan. Dan left us in 1995 when he was hired by the New York Times. Since then, he has been a city reporter, a national reporter, a sports reporter, and a columnist, filing stories from all 50 states and covering everything from the administration of Mayor Giuliani to the fallout from the 9/11 attacks to the pandemic we are all still experiencing today. While at the Times, he has twice been a nominated Pulitzer Prize finalist for feature writing and has won numerous other awards, including a Best American Newspaper Narrative Award. He is also the author of several books, including Bottom of the 33rd, about baseball's longest game, which was played in Pawtucket, Rhode Island.
Oh.
Welcome all to the Writer's Studio. I know that you'll leave tonight's gathering feeling like you've been treated to a master class by a masterful reporter and a lyrical writer. The format for tonight's studio will be this. I will be interviewing Dan for the first half of the show, and then I'll leave questions to you. If we don't have enough questions, I have plenty I'm prepared to ask. People who know me well know that I always have a lot of questions. I'd like to mention at the outset that audience questions should be centered on Dan's reporting and writing and not on larger issues at the New York Times, since this is a writer's studio and we have limited time. We'll go for 90 minutes until 8 p.m. Thanks for zooming in. So let's begin at the beginning, Dan.
Thank you for joining this. Must be a slow Monday night in Rhode Island. I don't know.
Yeah, and we all got dressed up to hear you.
Oh.
Okay. So what attracted you to journalism?
It's hard to believe looking at me now, but I used to be a scrawny kid who got beat up a lot. And so I developed an aversion for bullies. And it just, that coupled with the way that my parents communicated, which was through stories. My mother was born in Ireland, and so she would, rather than tell you to do something, she would tell you a story that took about 15 minutes, which basically amounted to, would you please mow the grass? And so, you couple those two things, I think, wanting to hold bullies accountable and also being drawn to stories as a way to understand the human condition. It was kind of natural, weirdly, that I was also socially challenged. So naturally I would go into journalism.
Okay. And what do you think the hardest thing is about being a journalist?
The hardest thing about being a journalist? I think that journalists, particularly journalists who are starting out, forget how powerful they can be, or rather how much power they have over another person's life or story. When you start out, you forget that the name you're typing into the computer is an actual human being, and it's kind of easy to maintain that distance between a printed name and an actual human being. And I think, at least in my case, as I grew older, I had a much keener appreciation for the human being behind the name, and being then very careful with the adjectives I would use. I would think twice about describing someone as bald, for example. And also making sure that when people gave me the gift of their story, that I treated it as such, that it was a fragile gift, and that I did right by them in telling their story fairly and accurately.
And I guess along that same line, what do you think the most important lesson you've learned as a writer?
The most important lesson I've learned, I would say it's connected to what I just said, that it really is an awesome responsibility. And I first realized this when I was working at a small newspaper in Connecticut outside of Hartford. You know, as you move along in your career, you tend to think on larger scales about Rudy Giuliani and things like that. But back in the mid 80s, you know, I was effectively doing the same thing, only on a smaller playing field. And I think it's really important to remember that when I write Mayor Marie A. Herbst of Vernon, that I understand that it's a human being and not a title or a name. I think the responsibility given to us is quite humbling, and I haven't forgotten that.
And going back to that same question, you were just talking about reporting, but what about the actual writing as far as how you think you've grown as a writer? The thing that sticks out to you most about actually telling the story, getting it on the paper?
I think as I've gotten older, well, a couple of things. You know, when I started out, I think I could be a bit smart alecky when it was inappropriate. You know, I think I've learned from that. And then I think that as I've grown older, I've become more attuned to the power of language, to the kinetic energy in how words are arranged. And so I look at poetry and I see how great poets will get maximum effect from a few words. And since I'm working for a daily newspaper, oftentimes I need to be, let's say, concise. So as I've grown older, I've learned more and more the power of language, and also the importance of narrative storytelling in helping people to navigate life. I think I wish I knew then what I know now. That's for sure. In Vernon, Connecticut.
So going along that same line, your writing is so lyrical, so poetic. There's this wonderful pacing and tension to it. And each word is very carefully chosen. So which poets or writers do you get inspiration from? I know you'll probably throw some Irish authors in there, but tell us, who do you read?
I do read a lot. And so I just finished the Robert Caro canon of, you know, the Lyndon Baines Johnson biography. And oftentimes I was listening to it, and I was listening to how he used language and how he elevated what could have been. First of all, I wasn't particularly interested in LBJ, but now he managed through his reporting, but really also through his writing, to make moments come alive that I never would imagine caring about. But so just for example, Caro, and let's just say how he described the airplane after JFK was shot and LBJ needs to be sworn in. Caro, through his reporting, is able to recreate the claustrophobic feel of the cabin, but also the historic import. So I've read everything that Robert Caro has written, who, by the way, started out as a hack newspaper reporter like me. I think his career has gone a little different than mine, but I read Seamus Heaney, the poet. He happens to have been Irish, as you point out, Tracy. Mary Oliver, another poet. colleagues of mine, Ellen Barry, who's a wonderful writer, who's based in New England. I read her. And I have to say, I was greatly influenced as a kid by tabloid newspapers. My house would get the New York Times on Sundays, but every day of the week we got Newsday and the Daily News. And so I read Jimmy Breslin and I read Pete Hamill. And so when you read, say, for example, Breslin, he is also a poet at his best in the column form. And so the way he used language and pauses and left to the imagination of the reader certain things was really impressionable on me.
In your mind, what makes for a great story, or at least what captivates your interest to jump in?
As I said to your class earlier today, and I apologize to those students for having to hear this stuff again. It was probably bad the first time. But I'm driven by curiosity, right? I'm actually interested in a lot of things. So curiosity is always at play. But then in telling a story, as I say, look through the tabloids in New York for what I might consider to be missed opportunities, or if I look at a news story in the Times to see if there's something that could be teased out of it. The essential ingredient has to be some kind of tension, some kind of challenge, something to be overcome or dealt with. And so once I see that, then I imagine myself in the skin, actually, of the person who is confronted with this challenge. And then if that person will agree to allow me to question them, I will debrief them to a fare thee well so that I feel as though I'm within their skin, so that when I'm writing about the moment, I can make it as real as possible. So I told the class one example. I wrote a story a couple of months ago about the pandemic in Queens. And there are several characters who figure in this long form narrative that we did. And one of them was a guy named Joe Farris, and he was a partner with a man named Jack Wongsarat. Jack succumbs to the pandemic in a hospital, and Joe has to fill out the DNR, and then Jack passes away in front of him, and then there's some paperwork that needs to be dealt with, and then his loved one is wheeled away. And so you could say, and then Joe Farris went home, right? So there was more to that, wasn't it? So I had him walk me through what he did after that moment. And I was so grateful that he would talk to me, you know, someone who was grieving and then reliving that loss for my benefit in a way, right? He stepped out onto the street in Queens. It's a late afternoon on a cold March day, and he's in friggin' Queens. And yeah, he walked home, but he's suddenly profoundly alone. And I asked him what he was feeling at that moment, and he effectively said everything and nothing. And so I interviewed him about that, and then I walked his walk home. He lived about a half mile from the hospital 3 or 4 times so I could know what he passed. And I tried to imagine what that must have been like. I know that in that long form narrative, a lot of people have paused at that moment because it was so raw and human and relatable. So that's what I try to do.
We're going to go back to the Queen story a little later, but
Did I jump the gun? I'm sorry.
Yeah, because there's so many things that you can learn from reading that piece. I think just doing something for a whole hour on that wouldn't be enough. But you referred a little earlier to your mom and your upbringing, and I'm wondering how your family history and upbringing have shaped your worldview when it comes to selecting the stories you want to report on? I mean, the stories you write mostly center on what I would call the little people, the voiceless, the people who live in the shadows, the same. There aren't many on the powerful, the privileged.
Well, I think the powerful and the privileged have enough people telling their stories. So I try to seek out people who don't have that benefit. It's a fair question. My father grew up in Depression era New York, and he had a very difficult childhood, very poor, constant evictions from apartments, so that he lived in all 5 boroughs. And he never went to college. He was wicked smart. He went to night school in high school, and then, became a striver on the streets of Wall Street. I used to joke that he would say he worked on Wall Street, but he literally worked on Wall Street. He was a cold caller, and then he lost that job for a variety of reasons and took a quote unquote menial job, or a low paying job near our house. He was, I would say, his default emotion was anger and a sense of that the bullies had the upper hand in society. And he was very, very well read, and very smart, very funny. And so I got that I wouldn't call it rage, but that desire for accountability from my father. And my mother was orphaned when she was about 15, and she came to the United States because there was no one really to raise her anymore. So she went to live with an aunt. I don't think she ever finished high school. I haven't found any record that she finished high school. And she got a job as a clerk, met my father at a church dance. And then she worked in a factory near about 10 miles from our house for, I don't know, 30 years. So, their experiences informed what I'm interested in. To think that these 2 anonymous working class people in a subdivision on Long Island would ever have agency in the daily discourse, I can't imagine they did. I can't imagine they ever felt that way. And so I think that has driven me to perhaps focus on people who otherwise would be voiceless.
When you're talking with these kinds of people that you're interviewing, do you have different personas that you put on, or different styles of interviewing depending on whom you're interviewing?
I have an assortment of disguises that I use. No, I say this all the time, that reporters don't have subpoenas, right? So when people talk to us, again, they're giving us something precious. I work at the New York Times now, and when I'm traveling the country, that can sometimes be a little bit of a burden. The New York Times is at times a controversial news outlet, let's say that. And and I'm also from the East Coast, right? So when I'm traveling around the country in Central Arkansas, to say, hi, I'm Dan Barry, I'm from the New York Times, will you talk to me? That can be a little bit off-putting to someone, okay? And so my trick is to have no tricks. My trick is to be myself, is to be authentic, explain who I am, explain what I'm interested in, and to convey my genuine interest in their story. I try to figure out whether it's self-deprecation or humor, or just telling them, just being straightforward. This is what I'm interested in. I came here because this happened to you, and I want to tell that story. I think it matters. And I think my experience is that almost always people respond to that. They respond to the lack of artifice. You know what I mean? They respond to someone saying, I'm interested in your story, and if you would be so kind enough to tell it to me, I will share it with others. But before I do that, I will check every fact with you, and then I will check every quote with you, and then I will check that the context in which those quotes appear are fair, because I can make you look like an idiot simply by quoting you accurately, but placing it in improper context. So I think that, you know, maybe they feel sorry for me, Tracy. I don't know. Like, look at this goofball. He clearly was beat up as a kid. I don't know, but that's my trick, is to be authentic and to be myself and be respectful. And if they decline, I say, I wish you would reconsider. Would you mind if I check in with you in a day or so? But not to harangue them for not speaking to me, or not demanding that they speak to me. Not using any kind of threat, whatever threat I might have, and not by deceiving them. It's by being straightforward with them. And I think most people respect that.
We have a lot of students who are on here tonight, and even for the people who aren't students, who are journalists, you know, most people won't end up working at the New York Times. So I guess, you know, they're going to start their careers, the students, in smaller newsrooms, probably covering, you know, cities and towns like we all did in the beginning. So what are some of the lessons that you've carried with you that you employ every day in your work at the top of your field that you actually picked up when you were working at these smaller papers covering smaller things, from editors, from other reporters, just from the people you interacted with?
I get, well, a couple of things. I mean, I don't have any, you know, magical thought on this. When I would cover school boards or a town council meeting, I worked for, in the very beginning, I worked for an afternoon tabloid in Connecticut. And that meant we had to work split shifts. We had to work from 7 to about noon, and there were 4 editions. So they were replating constantly. And then I was supposed to go home for several hours, and then go to a public meeting at 7 o'clock, cover it until midnight usually, and then get up and write that story and try to tease out 4 stories from that meeting. So a couple of things. First, that period between, say, 12 and the night meeting, I wouldn't go home, and I wouldn't rest, and I wouldn't have, I wouldn't nurture relationships. You know, what I would do is try to find a story that I wanted to tell. Okay. I would go to the Polish National Home in Enfield and listen to the guys at the bar and see if there was a story to write. That's what I would do. So first, when I was off the clock, I was still on. I was still looking for a story to tell, a story that I wanted to tell. Secondly, when I had to write 3 or 4 stories off a meeting, and every one of those stories is, you know, at the museum. No, you know, covering the zoning board of appeals meeting in Vernon, Connecticut. It's not the most exciting thing, but I would look at the agenda. I would look at the characters before me, and I would try to find a different way to tell the expected story. I would always look to make even a town meeting story a story with a beginning, middle, and end. And I would never, ever end a story with a throwaway quote signaling to the reader that, yeah, I'm bored too. I would always try to figure out an ending that had meaning, that made it a complete thing in and of itself. Even if it was a zoning board of appeals meeting about, you know, the new Stop and Shop going up on Tolland Turnpike or something like that.
How does a reporter develop a voice and a style without turning into an advocate for whatever he or she is writing about?
I don't think that's an issue. I think that by reading a lot and by thinking a lot about language as much as you can on deadline, some people who work constantly on deadline would be rolling their eyes to hear me talk, because you don't have a lot of time for beautifully crafted leads and meaningful endings. Though I would always strive for that. I've written thousands of deadline stories. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. I would say I never, Tracy, I never, ever, ever mail it in. That's all I can tell you. I'm always trying to figure out the best way to tell a story, the best lead. So when I'm writing a story, for example, I will spend a great amount of time on the first paragraph. I've talked about this before. I don't have a newspaper in front of me here. But if you pick up the New York Times, there are 6 stories on the front page. If you open up your laptop or even your cell phone and you're looking at the Times app, you have choices to make based on what the headline says and what the first paragraph says. So to me, it's a game, it's a competition. I want you to read my story. That means that you're going to look at the first paragraph, and that means I'm asking you for 6 seconds to read that first paragraph. And if it's beguiling enough, if it's interesting enough, maybe you'll give me another 4 seconds for the second paragraph. And then for the third paragraph, another 5-10 seconds. What are we talking about? 15. I'm asking you for 15 seconds of your life while you're being distracted by other stories. Okay. People read the newspaper and read websites with an eye for what not to read. This is what I think. They're looking for reasons not to read a story. Okay. I know that. I don't care about that. I don't. So this is the game. It's the game between the writer and the reader. So I have those few seconds in the beginning with the power of my language to draw you in. And if I'm successful, you'll stay with me through the end. Okay. So that has nothing to do with subjectivity or anything like that. It has to do with the choice of language, the conscious determination to be granular in detail and to figure out how to connect with the audience, whether it's with humor or poignancy or the immediacy of the moment.
So I know that you've mentioned before that you read everything aloud before you turn it in.
Yeah.
And actually that you read it to your wife, everything you write before you.
And we're still married.
Yeah. So talk about why you do that.
Just to annoy her. No. Because, and I'm the first person to say this. If you hear other people having said this, I'm the first one. No, I think that when you read aloud your language or your story or your words, laziness begins to shout at you. Repetition, unintended repetition shouts out at you. You hear the weakness in your story, okay? The weaknesses, and there are many. So by reading it aloud, I'm also kind of imagining how it is being digested by the reader, and I'm looking, oh, that's 3 paragraphs in a row that I began with the word but. Okay, I don't want to be doing that. Okay, I'm using passive tense here when it would be better to use active tense. Why am I doing that? Tense. So by reading it aloud, you're laid bare. Your language is laid bare, and then you have time to go back and make it less embarrassing.
So some of my favorite stories that you've written about are those where you zig instead of zag. I think that's a term that Jerry Lanson taught me. you manage to find these angles or perspectives to report on that other reporters overlook. For example, the story you did about the corpse that you found in New Orleans that was lying on the street, or, you know, after 9/11, you decided to go to the place where they were taking all the remains. And the Circle Line, what the Circle Line was like after 9/11, and the story about that little town in upstate New York where the factory was getting shut, which meant that the whole town was going to die as well. Are you always thinking in kind of universal themes like love and hate and loss and hope and resilience when you're seeking out stories? Or are you just seeking out, trying to find angles that no one else is writing?
First of all, I studied under Jerry Lanson at NYU, I think. He put up with me, that's for sure. Zigging instead of zagging, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't like people. No, I don't like being in a media scrum, okay? I don't like being with others trying to do the same thing. So as often, whenever I can, I break apart from the crowd, okay? And so I'm always challenging myself to tell a story that might be familiar in a new way. So, and again, apologies to your students, but an example of that is the Circle Line. So less than a month after 9/11, so those of you who were in New York at the time will remember, it was a profound sense of trauma and disbelief, and we'll never get past this. If you remember, Graydon Carter said it was the end of irony. Well, that didn't turn out to be the case, but it did feel like it was the end of something. And there were questions about whether New York would ever recover. And so, of course, slowly the city began to. And so on the day of 9/11, I got into the New York City. I live in New Jersey. I got into New York City by driving like a mad person to the Hudson River. I had to dump the car. I ran down a hill, and the Circle Line, which usually goes around Manhattan Island, and it's a tourism attraction, now was ferrying people from Manhattan into New Jersey, including people who didn't live in New Jersey. They just needed to get the hell off the island, okay? And so 600 people would be on the Circle Line coming to Weehawken, and then it would go back, and there would be 6 people, the crew. And so I ran through the crowd as they were getting off the disembarking and asked the captain if I can get a ride over to Manhattan. And he said, knock yourself out. And so I was on the Circle Line as it went back to Manhattan. And as we looked, it paused in the middle of the Hudson waiting for a berth to open up. And you could see the funeral pyre down at the bottom of the island. And so that's how I got into Manhattan. And then, you know, the next few days are a blur. And then a few weeks later, I'm trying to think of how to tell the story of Manhattan, how to tell the story of New York in a new way. And I remembered the Circle Line, and I checked, and they had just begun to resume their tourist attraction rides around the island. So what's that like? They have to go past Lower Manhattan. They have to go past the Battery Park area. What are they saying? How do they incorporate in their patter, you know, what happened? So I took that ride. And as I told your class, I've written it, it was 20 years ago that I wrote it, but what I remember most of all is that as the Circle Line was passing the smoke and the what was called the pile and then became the pit, there was a couple next to me, and they had been taking photographs all along. And when they came to that moment in the ride, the gentleman put his camera down and he said, it's too sacred to photograph. That's how my mind works. I can't help it. It's a fevered mind, but that's how my mind works. To look at what everyone is looking, but in a different way. Try to find a way to tell it differently so that it becomes fresh again, so that we don't become inured to someone blowing a hole in the bottom of Manhattan.
So before we open this up to questions, I would like to spend a few minutes talking about the most recent narrative recreation that you wrote for the Times called The Epicenter.
Yeah.
Took 8 months. It's 11,450 words.
Each one of them precious. No.
Yeah. In which you chronicled what was happening to people who were really sick with a virus who ended up at one of the hardest hit hospitals in March and early April, and how COVID affected this diverse community of immigrants in 5 interlocking communities in Queens.
Right.
This is a micro world where you capture where there are 800 languages spoken among the immigrants who live there, many of whom are undocumented. So, I mean, this is like a huge drawing board. And I'd kind of like to know, like, first of all, what was the genesis of this story, and how did you come to center on these 5, people or families that you were looking at?
So this is my tip of the hat to Tom Heslin. Okay. Every time I speak in public, I tip my hat to Tom Heslin, who was my editor at the Providence Journal. Okay. So if you remember, late March, so much was going on. I mean, we had just come off the impeachment. There was the presidential campaign. It was let's say, contentious. And there were so many things going on top of which there was a pandemic. Okay. And so things were happening so fast, it felt like we couldn't pause to consider what had just happened to us. This is how I felt. And so then in late March, the pandemic really hit Queens, and it lived up to its etymology in a way, right? Because Queens is the world, okay? And famously, 13 people died in 24 hours at Elmhurst Hospital, which really was the first time that the United States understood that we have a pandemic here. This isn't just Wuhan, China. This isn't Italy. This isn't a nursing facility in Washington State. This is going to be hell's a poppin'. So a couple of weeks later, I think in mid-April, I was looking for something to do, and I was overwhelmed by it. And I was looking for my way into this story. And I remember John Hersey's Hiroshima, right? Where he went back and really wrote the work that allows us to understand the human toll of that day, of that action. And I said to Cliff Levy, who was the editor of the Metro desk at the Times, we need to slow it down. That's Tom Heslin's phrase that he taught me almost 30 years ago. Slow it down, go back. And so I suggested, why don't we go back to Queens, in the neighborhoods around that hospital? We know that it's incredibly ethnically diverse, and pick a geospecific stretch, a mile, along the 7 train, which is a subway, which is an extraordinary story in and of itself, the 7 train, and use that as a spine with the hospital, and then find people weaving in and out of this defined space, including those who wind up going into the hospital and not all of them coming out. In other words, to try to figure out a way to make it alive, that you're experiencing it. So we did a lot of research through knocking on virtual doors at first, and also looking at Facebook pages, GoFundMe pages, all sorts of social media avenues where there would be memorials, or there would be money raised for a family who had lost a breadwinner. And and we also wanted it to be reflective of what the experience was, okay? So the Bangladesh community was getting hammered. A lot of Bangladesh men drive the Uber cars and the taxis in New York, and that industry was being hit hard. People who are living in subdivided apartments, or people that are doubling or tripling up in small 1 and 2 bedroom apartments because of the economy. Imagine trying to be socially distant in a 2 bedroom apartment where there are 10 people. We're living like that and are living like that. So how do you do that? So we thought about various ethnic groups, and we reached out to community advocates and also politicians, and then we drilled down. I went to Queens several times, and at the same time, we were working on the hospital to let us in, and finally they consented. So through a combination of bearing witness and going into the apartments and going into the hospital, but also doing a lot of work by phone because of the pandemic, we were able to recreate some approximation of what several families were going through at that time. So that's what happened.
And so how did it work? You were working with another reporter on this.
Right. So I worked with a wonderful reporter named Annie Coriel, who speaks Spanish, which was very important. And so we just divvied it up. I focused on the small funeral home director who was overwhelmed with the dead. I mean, you know, everything was turned upside down. There was no place to put the bodies. I mean, that's a truth. So I focused on the funeral home director. I focused on a couple, a Thai chef and his partner, and drilled down on their experiences. I focused on a former Buddhist monk from Nepal who was an Uber driver. Annie focused on a family where 11 people were living in one apartment. And she focused on Jamel Alvarado, a woman who was a cabaret singer, and she's in the lead of the story. She doesn't feel well the night that she's performing, so there's a sense of foreboding. So we divvied up the responsibilities and then collaborated. Annie would write pieces. I would figure out where it went, and we would synthesize it as we went. So it's 2 weeks in a specific place, and you follow these people as they go in and out of this area.
So when you were doing the writing, you guys were communicating by Zoom, because you weren't sitting in the same room writing, right? No,
we were not. No, I would write drafts and redrafts and redrafts, and Annie would make suggestions, and then I would synthesize her suggestions. We had, many Zoom conversations, to try and make this work. It was, it was difficult. It was challenging, right? But we had to bear witness, and so we went there.
Yeah. So obviously, with these kinds of interviews, which are so intense and so intimate, you're not doing those interviews by Zoom. You've got to be there in person, and you've got to be there to see. I mean, to create a sense of place, you've got to be there yourself as well, right?
Right. So there was a lot of interviewing done by telephone, but then after some things were addressed, or some information was collected, then we would go to the apartments and spend time with the people, and have, say, for example, Joe Farris to show me his apartment and where his partner Jack had collapsed, and so I could recreate it in a granular way. And so and I said this to your class. Not only am I, using my cell phone, I have to say it took me a couple of years to realize that I could use a cell phone for journalistic purposes. Like I was so trained to write everything down, and then suddenly I said, well, I could just take a photograph of it. But even then, I still am madly taking notes because if I'm writing about the hospital emergency room, for example, sure, I can take photographs, but I'm also taking notes because I want to remember what things remind me of. So later on in the writing process, if I want to describe the gurneys that are in the hall, maybe I came up with a metaphor that was possibly usable. I want to write it down. So I both have photographs, but I also have my contemporaneous notes where my mind is open to association and ways to make it real for the reader.
And how were you able to reconstruct so much detail? I think this is going to be my last question before I turn it over to the audience here for this piece.
We created a Google Doc, and it was chronological. And so it had notes in it, also what Mayor de Blasio was saying, and it was divided, it was chronological, and it had specific dates, okay? And so then under those dates from our reporting, we knew what Dawa Sherpa, the former Buddhist monk, was doing on this day. We knew what Jamel Alvarado was doing on this day. And we would have also, what did Mayor de Blasio say that day? What did the CDC announce that day? What did Donald Trump say? Donald Trump, who actually grew up maybe 6 miles from this hospital. I mean, it might as well have been the moon compared to the lived experience in this neighborhood from where he lived in Jamaica Estates, but he lived very close to this facility in this neighborhood. And so we had that huge Google Doc, and then my job was to come up with what is the opening? What is the opening scene that will draw you in so it doesn't read like another COVID story? And we landed on Jamel Alvarado performing in a cabaret that is mostly filled with absence on right when the full import of the coronavirus is being realized in Queens.
I'm going to turn this over to the audience now.
First of all, just a quick aside, Dan, if I was at NYU from 79 to 85, if I had you in a class or two, I don't remember, and I'm incredibly honored if that's the case, because yours is one of the bylines I have followed for decades with great appreciation. I wanted to ask you if you can go back. One of the stories that has always stayed with me, I think it was called Corpse on Union Street. It's the one with the dead body. At the time of Katrina, what really struck me about that story was, here were all of these stories filled with statistics about the horror of what was going on there. And that story was just so evocative of the city. It was so filled with sensory material. It used the geography of the city so beautifully. I wondered what your assignment was when you went down there. And that was all the stories that I read about Katrina, which everybody followed very closely. That was the single story that most stuck with me. I've used it in teaching as well since.
Oh,
and I was curious what how going into that chaos, if you recall, it was just a much shorter story. It was probably a story that you had to turn fairly quickly given the event. How did you go into the reporting and writing of that piece? If you recall, you've done thousands of stories since, or at least hundreds.
No, thank you for remembering. I was writing a New York City column at the time, but Katrina had happened and I just felt I needed to go there. And so I asked permission to go down and they said yes. And the benefit of that was I didn't really have an assignment, okay? The assignment was see what you see and come up with something. And I wound up writing actually several stories there, and I kept going back for months and months. I would go back. And so a photographer named Nicole Benjavino and I were just driving around and taking it all in. And the first thing that happened as we're driving around, all the street lights are out. And so cars are going the wrong way on streets. And it struck me, this is lawless. This is anarchy. The system has broken down here. And we drove by some National Guardsmen, and they had their guns pointed at a man's head, and he was on the ground. This is like I think it was a Saturday afternoon, and you're just driving, and then you see this, and it's just like there's a movie over there. What's going on? So we got out of the car, and things are so screwed up. I could walk right up to the man who was on the ground with his face planted in the ground and his hands behind his head, and the guardsman is like maybe 3 feet from me. Like there was a surreality to what was going on. And I said, "Hey, what's going on?" And the guy said, "They say I robbed that record store. I didn't rob any record store." And just then a car pulled up going the wrong way and had tinted windows. And the guy pushed the driver pushed the window down, and he said, "Hey, how do you get to the interstate?" Like totally oblivious to the drama that was occurring. And the guardsman said, "I don't know, I'm from Kansas." And at that moment, I said, "This is out of control." Okay. And so from then on, I was just taking in moments, really driving, taking in moments. And then as we were doing this, as the story says, we're in downtown now. We're in downtown, and that was mostly dry. And we saw like what looked like feet jutting out from under a tarp in the middle of the street. It wasn't on the sidewalk. It was in the middle of the street. And I said, let me go look at it. I honestly thought it was a mannequin. And I went over, and it's a dead body. It's a dead body in the middle of the street of a major American city. And so we couldn't believe it. And as the story says, some National Guardsmen come up and they look at the body, and one takes a photograph, and then another guy turns around and blesses himself, and then they leave. And I go, "This is crazy. Why aren't they collecting the body?" So I told a state trooper. He said, "Yeah, I put the tarp on that a couple of days ago. We didn't want the CNN trucks to run over it." Like, what I couldn't believe what I was seeing and what I was hearing. And so we had to leave the city because of a curfew. And we drove all the way to Baton Rouge because that's where we were staying, and then got up early in the morning. And I remember telling Nicole, "What do you think the chances are that that body is still there?" Right? No way. This is America. The body was still there. Boom. That's it. I called the editor. I said, I have a lead. There's use that as the metaphor, or use it as the way in. And so I wrote the lead, sent it to the desk. And then as Nicole drove and we continued to take in whatever we could, I wrote the story on a laptop, not knowing how the story would end, because it would depend on whether the body was picked up by the end of the night at the end, when we had to leave at curfew. So we wrote around, and I updated, and I was writing and writing. Nicole, that body's got to be gone, right? I was ready to write whatever, and sure enough, the body was still there. And so, boom, that was the end of the story, and I sent it in. So I benefited because I had no particular assignment. And you're right about the stats, and what was the mayor's name? Ray Negron, or I forget, but some reporter for the New York Times had to stay on top of City Hall. Some reporter had to stay on top of the Army Corps of Engineers. I didn't have to, which is a blessing to me. And so that's how that came about, Jerry. It was just like, see what you can see. And so I wanted to make people feel the chaos, the chaos of this great American city several days after the hurricane hit.
Thank you.
We have a question from Sky.
Sky Robinson.
Yeah, I was wondering, so you mentioned that it took many months to write several of your pieces, and you seem to interview people in great depth, and you have a way of following in their footsteps and trying to really get into their skin. So how do you deal with your relationships that then come up with these subjects, and writing a story that is unbiased, or writing a story that is true even when it's difficult, or that has to do with your understanding of the situation, even if your subject doesn't feel that way? How do you deal with the interactions with these people that you report on?
I don't know what you mean by unbiased. If I'm going to tell the story of Joe Farris, the gentleman who lost his partner, I want to convey to the world what he was thinking. That is part of the story. So there's no question of subjectivity or objectivity. There is empathy. I think there's empathy and compassion. But if Joe Farris did something, questionable, it would have been in the piece as well. Okay, if someone had cut a line to get treatment or something like that, that wasn't the nature of the story. And when I write stories, oftentimes I'll stay in touch with people because we've gone through something together. It seems rather chilly not to say, how you doing and how do you like the story? Is there anything we missed? Or, let me know if you need anything. And that continues with a lot of people I write about to this day. I don't see any issue with trying to get into someone else's story to tell their story.
So I have a few questions about the story that you wrote about Song Yang, which I spent maybe an hour reading. It was an incredible story to read. And I mean, there's so many parts to it, so many different people involved, so many different angles into the life and death of this woman. So I'm wondering how you began your reporting and then how you proceeded. And I also, one specific thing I'm wondering about how you structured the piece is how did you decide when to tell the reader that she had died? Because you wait a few sections before you arrive to that.
No, she dies in the beginning, doesn't she? So well, anyway, we can talk about that. But and again, I asked the forbearance of Tracy's class, but what happened was I'm over other newspapers and the Sure. The story that Marina's referring to is about a woman named Song Yang, who was a Chinese immigrant who wound up working in the massage parlors in Flushing, Queens, not too far from the Epicenter. And that business had become such that women would stand out on the street and open for massages, which was really cover for and there's nothing hidden about it. It was this entire street was taken over by this industry, and so I got interested in it because one of the tabloids had written a very brief story about it, and the headline was something along the lines of "Fleeing cops, prosti leaps to death," and so I got, quite frankly, Marina, I got pissed off. I didn't like the word prosti. I didn't like a life reduced to that word. And by the way, I've never heard the term prosti before. It was a late night tabloid headline person's decision to label her as a prosti. And so I got pissed off. And so that's how I got involved in it. Well, who was she? Who was she? And what is this world? Why is this okay? What drove her to this profession? I'm not making clear it should be legal or illegal. It is at this time in New York illegal. But who was she? I mean, that's the overarching question. How did she fall out or jump out of a window, and why? And the reason was the police were coming to arrest her again. They were coming up the stairs. She heard them knocking on her door. and she either slipped or jumped out the window rather than deal with the police, and that would have jeopardized her hopes for a green card. That's what was happening. So I don't speak Mandarin. I look like a cop. And so I teamed up with another reporter named Jeff Singer, who is unbelievably fluent in Mandarin and also had many connections in the Flushing community, the Flushing Chinese community. And so gradually, we mostly through Jeff, we were able to insinuate ourselves into that world and hear the stories of women like Song Yang and where they came from and how they wound up doing this work, rather than having them be these anonymous women on the street calling after men as they walk to the train. And as for the opening, I think, Marina, I describe her falling, and then we suspend her in midair, and then provide context, and then she falls. So I think the narrative trick was, okay, this woman, we're not going to be cute about this. This woman died, okay, and then we retell the story so that it's almost like a film noir technique that you'll see in movies from the 40s, where the climax in a weird way is at the beginning, but you then are wondering, well, how did it come to this point? So we retell the story. But thank you.
So
Everyone's falling asleep. That's why.
so going back to the story that Marina was talking about, could you talk about the process that you and Jeff had in gaining the trust of the sex workers that you were talking with, and also how you were able to earn the trust of Song Yang's family when they came to try and understand what had happened to their loved one?
Let me answer the first part of that question, then I want to hear again what you said about the family. So as I said, I look like a cop or a dissolute, and so very easily into the world of Mandarin-speaking sex workers in Flushing. And so Jeff, who was very fluent, and I spent a lot of time on the street trying, buying bubble tea in the summer and buying hot tea in the winter, because they would be out at 2 a.m. Soliciting or calling out, massage. And so that really wasn't going very far. But as I said to your class earlier, I got a sense of how fluent Jeff Singer was. And he's a schlubby guy from Staten Island, okay? And he and I would go to lunch, and he would order the food for us because the waiters were often only speaking Mandarin. And his fluency and his command of the vernacular and the slang and the way to speak was the opposite of academic and formal. He was very good at how people speak in Mandarin. And people would stop what they're eating and look at him and compliment him and joke with him, and he would joke back with them. And so this came to bear one night when we were trying to ask a couple of women some questions, and also we're disrupting their work. You know what I mean? If men were inclined to avail themselves of their services, it's not going to happen with these two knuckleheads standing there, right? So it was hard. And so Jeff is trying to talk to a couple of the women, and another woman came over. She was like the boss lady in this little area. And she said, "If you're so good, where am I from?" And Jeff said, say a few more words. And she did. And he was able to pinpoint not only the province she came from in China, but the city and almost the exact neighborhood where she came from, because there are different ways of speaking, similar to the way there are different dialects in New York, or there used to be, right? And all the other women started laughing in appreciation, like in wonder, and he was in. He was in. They invited him up for a hot pot, and they talked to him constantly and opened up to him because they trusted him. That's how we were able to do that. In terms of the family, what was the question, Tracy?
When her family came over to try and discover what really happened to her, and obviously they didn't trust that she had taken her own life.
Right.
How were you able to gain their trust? I mean, you really captured not just her life, but their frustration too,
Right.
and who they were as grieving family members.
We spent a great deal of time with them, and the son, Song Yang's brother, spoke English, which was good for me, so that I could be very active in those conversations. I'll tell you the truth, that at the very beginning, the son was convinced that the police had thrown his sister over the railing, and he was determined to prove that. And I'll tell you that when I first looked at this story, that was absolutely among the options that I was considering, because I didn't know what happened. I'm not going to assume that the police acted admirably, and I'm not going to assume that they acted horribly. I was open to that possibility. And so in a weird way, the two of us, or the three of us, Jeff and I and the brother, were trying to investigate what happened. So we developed a relationship as that went. And I'll tell you that it became clear to me very early on that the police hadn't thrown this poor woman over the railing. They had video, surveillance video, showing what happened. But he refused to believe it, and I think he got upset with us that we weren't solving the case for him and proving that the police had killed his sister. There was nothing we could do with that, and we were not cute about it. We told him, well, we don't, Songhai, we haven't been able to find that. And but he came to terms with that, and I have to tell you that in April of 2020, when New York was going through the craziness of the pandemic, of all people, Songhai sent me a note from China to see how I was doing and wishing me well and saying he was worried. Like, that was unbelievable.
Hi, I was hoping you could chat a little bit about the story that you wrote on the mother and baby home in the west of Ireland. I think it was published in 2017. Specifically, I'm wondering, one, just how you kind of came across that story. I know that your mother is Irish, but if you could talk a little bit about sort of how you decided that that was something you wanted to write about. And the second question, I was hoping you could chat about how you decided on the first sentence, "Behold a child." I mean, it's this big, sprawling, intense story. And I'm just wondering kind of at what point in your writing and reporting process that sentence, something so simple but so powerful, came to you as a good place to start the story.
Thank you. Thank you so much for even remembering the first three words. I'm just writing it down to remind me. Right, my mother is from Ireland, and she's from County Galway, and I've spent a lot of time in Ireland. And Tuam is maybe 40 minutes from where my mother was born and spent her childhood. I read a lot about the case, and so for everyone who doesn't necessarily know, Ireland has been going through a real painful reckoning with its past for the last few years, because similar to the Magdalen laundries that maybe you've heard about, beginning at the start of the formation of the Republic of Ireland, or out from under British rule in the early 1920s, this new government was trying to figure out what to do with all sorts of issues, including social services. And at the time, it was a very heavily Catholic country. And so what do you do with women who become pregnant out of wedlock? Well, we have to hide them from the rest of us because it's a shame. It's shameful. And so these institutions were set up where women, young women, oftentimes who were unwed and were pregnant, would go until they gave birth, and it's a horrific thing, because in one of the institutions, and not all of them were run terribly well, let's put it that way, and in one institution, the death rate of these babies and young children was off the charts, and in this facility, which was actually a converted workhouse dating from a poorhouse dating from the 1850s. The nuns didn't know what to do with the bodies, or for whatever reason, and they buried them in a retired septic system. They wrapped them in cloth and buried them in like these tunnels beneath the facility that were once part of the septic system. And so this became known because of one woman who didn't go to college, who was a local woman, and she was trying to do a feature story for the local historical magazine, and she couldn't make sense of the numbers. Well, where did all these dead babies go? And so that led her on this incredible journey of investigation, where she determined that some 800 bodies perhaps were buried, in the septic system. I read a lot about it before going there, and I was, quite frankly, unimpressed with how this woman, Catherine Corliss, was being presented. I didn't think she was coming across as fully realized, and I wanted to know what motivated her. Why did she continue to pursue this, even though the local newspaper was giving her a hard time, even though the local Catholic Church was giving her a hard time and lying to her? Why does she keep going? And she agreed to talk to me. So the story is as much about this heroic woman as it is about the actual scandal itself. As for the opening, Behold the Child, honest to God, I must have been taking hallucinogens. I don't know how that came. It seemed to me that I wanted to evoke a break in the sacred trust. I wanted to evoke something faintly biblical, sort of like, it sounds a little like the Beatitudes. And so I was trying to figure out how to begin it. And, you don't want to begin, when Catherine Corliss was 7 years old, I don't want to do that. So I took a step back and took a long walk, and then came up with that. And I was very, very glad that the editor didn't cut it, Behold the Child, because it's about the children. It's about the loss of the innocent and the loss of a country's innocence in a way, right?
Yeah, I was wondering, when you started writing, I assume that you chose at some point to be or to not be in the stories that you write. How did you make that choice?
Sometimes I'm in the stories that I write. But as a journalist, I would say that that the story is always about others. You can make it about yourself. It's interesting. You can use the first person so that a place becomes the actual character, and you're just the Virgil taking the reader through the situation, and it's not really about you so much as what you're seeing and how you convey that. But almost always, the position is that the story is about others. That's what you're doing. And so that's why you don't see it all that much now. What's interesting, though, is that in the New York Times and in other publications, you're seeing more and more first-person references in the report. And one of the reasons that is, it kind of, I don't know how I feel about it, but one of the reasons is that studies apparently indicate that people do not understand the meaning of a dateline. So if I have a dateline that says Detroit, okay, that would mean that I was in Detroit, okay? Not that I was writing about Detroit from my desk in New York, but I was actually in goddamn Detroit. Studies are showing that some people don't understand that they don't know that that's what that indicates. And so as trust in the media is going through, is in flux, if we can say that, there are writers and editors who think, well, let's put it in the story to make it clear that as I walk the streets of Detroit, so as to indicate, yeah, we were there. It's not just, we're not just putting the name of a city or a town there for fun.
Can't you just do that at the end though, to show where the reporting was done, as opposed to putting it in the first person?
You could, but I'm old school. I like seeing, oh, Dateline Detroit. Oh, someone is going to take me to Detroit. That's kind of exciting. I mean, you'll have to take that up with the journalistic gods, Tracy. That goes way back.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying, if you think people are confused by datelines, can't we explain that the reporting was done
rather than use first person?
Yeah, which I think is.
So you don't like first person?
No.
Okay. All right.
Not much in journalistic writing. I mean, if you're writing a column, for sure, but in the news page, in the news pages, I don't know. I mean, you're not doing that much anyway.
Right. I agree with you that it should be used sparingly, but there are times when it is when it's appropriate.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So I'm a local news reporter in Connecticut, and
Where?
New Haven Register.
Sure.
And I find that when you're able to really follow and become immersed in a town, the stories kind of flow, and you know who to call, and people trust you, so they get you the info first. So when you're traveling and you have to sort of go into a community that's totally new to you, how do you decide where to look for your stories, and also how do you become comfortable so that you feel that you're giving a proper understanding of the context of the place?
Right. Usually when I go to a new community somewhere around the country, I have a reason for going. So I've already identified a story or an issue that I want to explore. Right. So I don't need someone to explain that to me. And as I said earlier today in the class, I do a lot of research before I go to a community. I don't want to parachute in and out. I want to, whenever possible, spend some time there. And if that's not possible, then I need to own the information about this community as much as I can. So that means doing a lot of online research before I go to the place. So I'm talking about going across the country, so I'm not talking about, going from Vernon to Manchester. Do you know what I mean? But so I would do a lot of research before I left. And then once I went there, I would drive around, notice the architecture, look at the statues and the memorials. That gives me a sense of what is what this community is proud of, or what this community wants to remember. And then I go to the local public library and I ask for the local history section. And invariably there's a few volumes, one of which is, the centennial of Pottstown, 1850, 1950. And as silly as that sounds, I will read that because I'm looking at surnames, I'm looking at what people are proud of and why their high school basketball team is called the Pioneers. I want to know that. And so then I will find the stack of local newspapers, the New Haven Register or the Journal Inquirer, and I'll read several weeks of them. I'll sit there and go through them until I feel like I'm at least, getting some sense of what the issues of the day are, what is the little drama going on at the town council. And then from that, I will have developed some people that I want to call and learn some more. So that's what I do.
I work in adoption studies, so the Chuum situation came to my notice a while ago, and then I saw your piece on it when it came out in 2017 or so. I think that's right. And
Right.
the question that I had actually was about how much input you had into the visuals associated with that particular piece, which were really stunning. It was one of the most beautiful things I've seen.
Yeah.
I know the text, of course, you wrote, but did you have much say in the pictures or any of the video that came with that, and especially that long section where there are interviews and things like this?
Yeah, I conducted those interviews. And so I worked with Cassie Bracken. I've worked many times with her. She's a wonderful videographer and a wonderful journalist. As an aside, as a reporter, never call the person next to you my photographer. Okay, that's a no-no. And what I learned is working with photographers. It's one of the joys of my job is working with photographers and asking them what they're seeing. At the end of the day, we'll go to a bar. Usually, it's like a TGIF's, because that's the only place in town, and have a bad piece of frozen salmon and talk about, well, what did you notice? Did you notice when he said this? Because photographers and videographers are consummate journalists. And Cassie Bracken is at the very top of that. And so she and I did a lot of interviews together, but and helping. But the visual vision was entirely Cassie's.
It was interesting going into academia. So I've discovered there's a whole academic study of literary studies. There's an International Association of Literary Studies. There's a literary studies journal that's been around for about 10 years. Dan, would you say that the kind of work that you and Ellen Berry do and so on is there's a future to that, and that it'll be studied in the academy years from now? Is this a golden age or is it dying out? Because I love everything you've said, and it matches looking back at John Hersey or looking back at Joseph Mitchell and all of that.
So I think, Doug, you're referring to long form narratives. And so I think it's counterintuitive. I think that we think that our collective attention span has been shrinking. And so that we don't have time for stories. So now we rely on, tweets to inform us. But the analytics show that when a story is well told, okay, no matter its length, people will gravitate toward it and will stay with it. So the New York Times can tell me how many people opened up a story I've written and how long they stayed with the story. And Ellen's story last year about an Indian prince was the analytics were off the charts. The story about Song Yang, the story about the Epicenter, they did extremely well among readers because, and okay, so perhaps the way it's written helps, but what these stories are doing are inviting readers in for a journey, and readers want to be taken on a journey, and readers gravitate towards stories because stories, since time began, help us understand the human condition. That's how we communicate, okay? I can tell you something and you listen, but if I tell you a story, you're engaged. And I think the analytics are showing that. So I think the craft of long form journalism or narrative journalism doesn't have to be long, You know, people want to be told stories, and I think that'll continue.
And on that note, I think we should wrap that up and call it a night. Thank you all for coming and listening to Dan. And Dan, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. Good luck with the rest of your week, everybody. And Dan, will be in touch soon. Thanks all for zooming in to this writer studio, and we'll see you all soon, I hope.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.